Hello, welcome back to the show. Events are unfolding in Ukraine which indicate that time may be running out for Ukraine in terms of this war with Russia, in terms of it having the ability to achieve its goals of finding bargaining powers to negotiate with Russia. There is talk of the Jeddah peace talks, which are scheduled to occur in the near future, Saudi Arabia hosting them. These were pre-planned peace talks organised by the US some months ago, most likely. Interestingly, they exclude Russian representatives from the peace talks, and they are starting to fall apart, perhaps for more reasons than one. Mexico has decided not to attend, giving the reason that if Russia's not there, then these aren't real peace talks. And given the shape of the Ukrainian offensive, today we are the 3rd of August, so we are 1 day away from starting the 3rd month of the offensive, and the Ukrainian offensive has not made any significant ground during that time. There have been some small villages and hamlets captured along the Vremyanka ledge. There was some ground made around Pityatki on the far west of the Zaporozhye region. There have been advances made down to the east of Robotne. But in all of these cases, the fighting has remained in the grey zone. The advances of the Ukrainians haven't made it to the reinforced Russian defensive lines. There has been one video footage surface of a single, perhaps, infantry fighting vehicle making it to the first line of Russian defence from a few days ago. However, this appears to be perhaps either a crew that managed to get lost and travel down and make it to the line, who then appeared to abandon their vehicle and send it out on its own. I've heard people reporting they think it may have been a crew that were perhaps defecting or surrendering, attempting to surrender. I think perhaps more likely it was a lucky advance, and then the footage showing the vehicle driving, it appeared to be driverless in the way it manoeuvred, may have been an attempt to try to draw Russian fire and try to reveal where Russian positions may have been and what response the Ukrainians could expect if they arrived there in larger numbers. The footage seems to have been shot from the Russian side, and no response was indicated or shown. The vehicle crashed into a large ditch, and that seemed to be the end of it. But apart from that, really the Ukrainians haven't reached the Russian defensive line, and they are small amounts of territory claimed by the Ukrainians. Some of those areas are areas which are routinely fought backwards and forwards, claimed by the Russians and then the Ukrainians. So they may be a small settlement or village which has been now effectively leveled by artillery fire. And it's really unsafe for either side to inhabit the area. Yet, in terms of PR advantage, they will send some soldiers down there and take some video of them being in the town, claim they control the town, and then quickly evacuate out of there before they're shelled by the other side. So these small advances are then balanced and perhaps even overrun by the advances made by the Russians in the northern area, the Kupiansk, Kharkiv region. Through that area, we've seen the Russian forces make continued small advances over the last couple of weeks. And I imagine the ground taken there probably outweighs the amount claimed by the Ukrainians so far. So we see that time's running out. The wet season is coming, the Raspunita, which is when the mud begins. So once we get into sort of October, the rains start, and there's a period where fighting will stop due to the inability to move armoured vehicles through the muddy fields. That will remain that way until the winter sets in and the ground freezes, and then militarised warfare can recommence. Ukraine are also under pressure, allegedly from the West, from US and Joe Biden, to show success before December. And if that doesn't occur by December, then US military aid to Ukraine will begin to decrease. And it's that military aid which is keeping Ukraine alive at the moment in this conflict. One interesting thing that appeared on the news yesterday was to do with the Odessa port of Izmail. Now, Izmail, I'll just zoom in here for those of you who are just listening. I'm just showing a map here of Odessa in the southwest of Ukraine. And we can see where we have the river, the Danube River, running up here. And this forms the border with Romania and Ukraine on the western side, southwestern side of Odessa, and the Izmail seaport here. Now, what is interesting about this, the Izmail seaport is the second of the two ports on the Danube River that the Russians have struck with missiles, the other being the Reni port a little further inland, a few 20 or 30 kilometres or so further west. However, the Izmail port is of interest given that just this week it's been reported that an Israeli tanker or an Israeli freighter ship has moved its way up to the Danube port and into the Izmail Sea. Now, this was something that was expected to happen after the Russians had announced that they would be effectively placing a blockade against any of the Odessa ports. The grain deal was over, and so the Russians have announced that any ships travelling through to Odessa ports would be considered to be military targets. Now, a game of brinkmanship has erupted here, I suppose, where the Russians had seen, it was very obvious that this Israeli ship was travelling this way. They didn't strike it in the water. Instead, overnight, the Russians have struck the port of Izmail, where this ship sailing under the Israeli flag is alleged to have docked. So in this regard, it seems as though the Russians are drawing a red line and saying, look, we're not going to fall for a trap and sink a ship in the Black Sea here and cause an international problem there with another nation. Instead, we will bomb and shell and missile attack the ports. And if your ships, from whatever nation they are, happen to be in those ports and are damaged by the strike on the ports, then that's not our consequence. We weren't attacking your ships, we were attacking the ports. So this is an interesting situation. Again, though, the Russians showing quite sternly that they're not willing to tolerate the reopening of trade through the Odessa ports or transfer of grain, or I think in the Russians' case, the transfer of military material through those ports. So we can see that Ukraine, in terms of its access to ports to export grain, to import weaponry or export weaponry through the Odessa ports, has been choked off. The rains are coming. They do appear to be running out of time. There are reports that where the heavy fighting in areas such as Klishchiivka, which is just south of Bakhmut, Chomsk, that some of the fighting there may be perhaps the last throws in that area, the big push that has been happening, because there has been very intense fighting there, very intense artillery duels in this area. There are some other reports from Russians along the front line in the Zaporozhye region that some of the fighting there or some of the resistance of the Ukrainians may be decreasing in intensity. I can't corroborate that, but that's some of the reporting that's coming out. This makes me wonder what might happen in Avdiivka. So Avdiivka is just northwest of Donetsk city, and this is allegedly the location from which the Ukrainian forces have shelled Donetsk city since 2014. The Russians haven't taken control of Avdiivka, yet they have for a period of time now encircled Avdiivka. The Russians have fire control over the last road into Avdiivka and have effectively set up a pincer around that the Ukrainians that are in there, and may be undertaking the same strategy the Russians took with Bakhmut, which was to develop what they call a cauldron, to leave a small entryway in for reinforcements, but then to attack from all sides and attrit those Ukrainian forces within Bakhmut. In Avdiivka, it seems as though the Russians are thinking that the Ukrainians will value the artillery locations they have there, the ability to shell Donetsk city, and that it would be a major PR loss to the Ukrainians to have it known that Avdiivka has been lost to the Russians. And so they will continue, the Ukrainians will continue to reinforce to hold on to Avdiivka. So I think that we may see that Avdiivka, if there is a slowing in the Ukrainian offensive, or if it does stop, that Avdiivka may become a place to watch where we may see sort of the last stand in this southern Donetsk region occurring, where the Ukrainians will fight to hold on to Avdiivka as long as they can. The Russians may use that to advantage and keep the pinchers open to allow the Ukrainians to reinforce and to attrit more Ukrainians, and then perhaps ultimately, if the Russians decide that they do wish to advance in this area themselves, may then close off the cauldron and claim control over Avdiivka. Look, on the front lines, there hasn't been great news of any great advances in either direction at the moment. We still have more information coming through about the escalating tensions in Africa, with Niger allegedly announcing that they have cut off supplies of gold and uranium to the west, to France. France is a heavily dependent nation on uranium for its electricity supply. France has a large number of nuclear reactors, and a large percentage of that uranium is supplied from Niger. Niger is now gaining support from a number of nations, from a number of its neighbouring West African nations, Algeria, Mali, Burkina Faso. Here we go. Just for those listening, just going to the map of Africa here. Niger, Algeria, Mali, Burkina Faso have all, as long as Guinea, have all committed their support to Niger. That if ECOWAS, the economy of West African states, which has announced that it may take action against Niger, the supporting states of Algeria and Mali and Burkina Faso are saying that they will support Niger in a conflict if that occurs. Now, it's highly likely that if Niger stick to their guns and do not allow uranium and gold shipments to proceed to France, that France will be forced into military action to open up those pathways to their uranium again. The French do have approximately 1,500 to 2,000 forces in Niger. The US have 1,000. The new government in Niger, due to the coup, have said to the Americans that they no longer wish to have their forces in the country. I've read an article today that the Americans have said, regardless of that, they're keeping their troops in Niger, which effectively then makes those American forces an occupying force within Niger. So this is an area which is just teetering on inflaming and erupting into a West African war supported by the West. There's also the added element of Wagner fighters and Wagner forces being in Mali. Mali borders Niger, and if Yevgeny Prigozhin has announced early this week that if needed, they could help support Niger in dealing with any terrorist activity that it had to deal with. Okay, just a quick one from now, but thank you if you've watched this. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. I look forward to talking to you again soon.